Thank you for joining me for these live internet studies. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. These are the live internet studies, and they're broken up into two major segments or sections. The first hour of the hour and a half long study is for a topic known as eschatology, a biblical study of end time events. It's basically a study on the book of Revelation, but we're just going topic by topic until we reach the book of Revelation, and then we will turn into that book as well. Right now, we're parked out on making a case for one of the rapture views known as the pre-wrath rapture. The second 30-minute segment of my hour and a half long study is dedicated to an apologetic topic known as a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism, and we're just looking at certain Bible verses and trying to ascertain whether they are Trinitarian leaning or otherwise non-Trinitarian leaning. We're taking a kind of perspective over and against the biblical Unitarian view, and right now we've just begun looking at a passage in the book of Isaiah, chapter 43, right around verse 11, where God declares that He is the only Savior, and we're asking the question, if God is the only Savior, where does Jesus fit in? So stick around for that topic if you like topics like that. But for now, let's turn to eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. I'm going to go back to using a format that I used a long time ago when I first started doing these eschatology studies. I'm going to try and work from a PowerPoint. And so I created these slides in advance. There's about 50 of them. We're going to be dealing with, as I advance forward, we're going to be dealing with the topic of making a case for the pre-wrath view. You can see on my topic list in front of you that there are 18 topics to this study so far. As of when I put this last update in place, this could be subject to change, but for now, this is what we're working from. So let's describe the main rapture views before we jump into making a case for the pre-wrath view. The first of four main views that we're going to be looking at is, and I'm only mentioning by way of overview because we've talked about these extensively, so I don't want to wax long. So I'm just flashing these views in front of you. But pre-tribulation rapture is one of the more popular views, especially among Protestant and evangelical Christians. Perhaps it's not as popular among Orthodox-leaning groups, Catholic groups, Lutheran groups, things like that, maybe even Pentecostal groups. So, pre-tribulation rapture, where in the scheme of things is a rapture? You have to imagine, by looking at the screen, at this graphic, that there's a 7-year time period known as either the 70th week of Daniel or the 7-year tribulation, or Daniel's last 7 or something like that. But it's a 7-year time frame, and the rapture takes place at the very beginning, or it maybe initiates God's wrath. Either way, it's at the very beginning of the 7. That's essentially what the name is implying, is that Christians are exempt from the tribulation, which is defined as the wrath of God. Therefore, pre-trib is actually one of the original pre-wrathers, if you want to get ultra technical, but they don't use that label pre-wrath. They just call themselves pre-trib. The next rapture view that we have been interacting with is the one that has lost a lot of popularity in the last, say, 30 years. It's known as the mid-trib rapture. It still has some adherents, but it's been really overtaken by the pre-wrath view that we're going to look at in a moment. Mid-trib takes the same 7-year slice of history, and it cuts God's wrath down to only 3.5 years. Christians go through some tribulation, but God raptures us in the middle of the tribulation, just before God's wrath and the great tribulation is poured out. These slides, by the way, were provided by Zion's Hope, David Rosenthal, who's the son of the late Marvin Rosenthal, who's one of the fathers of the pre-wrath view. He put these slides together. So this is his perspective. His research is what we're seeing here, which seems to be consistent with other authors that I've researched on my own. I'm just borrowing these slides, but because they're so nicely put together and they're consistent in their color schemes. Mid-trib has rapture basically right in the middle of the 70th week, and God's wrath occupies the other 3.5 years, and then there's the second coming. The post-tribulation rapture, which is the third one on our list, this one is very, very popular. It's becoming more and more popular, especially as it argues diametrically opposed or against the pre-trib model that we just looked at earlier. Basically, as far as I can tell, everything is the same. God's wrath is the full 7 years, tribulation and great tribulation for the first and second half, respectively. You got the midpoint there and everything. The only difference from this one versus the pre-trib one we saw earlier is that in this model, this version of the pre-trib model, the rapture takes place at the very end, synonymous with the second coming. So the two events are one on top of the other, or they're very close to another, so close that you can't tell them apart, something like that. I guess we believers go up into the air, meet the Lord, get our resurrected bodies if you were dead, or be transformed if you were living, meet the Lord and the angels, and then we just we mount the white horses that came out of heaven as well, I guess. And I got a problem with those horses. I keep talking about those horses are really messing with my mind. Are the horses on the cloud? Are the horses coming back riderless until we Christians get on them? Okay. Anyway, just being a little funny there. But we all come back down to earth and do battle with Antichrist, etc., etc. So that's kind of the post-trib version. And then we have this final view, this fourth view. There's another view actually known as partial rapturism, and there's even a sixth view known as preterist rapturism, but I'm not even really giving those a serious consideration, since in my opinion, they just kind of fall off the list because of their nonsensical way in which they are kind of held together. So these four, the last one, but certainly not least, it's the one that I hold to. It's the pre-wrath rapture. And it's the same 7-year slice, but notice what happens to the 7 years. We've got the beginning of sorrows occupying the first 3.5 years. Then at the midpoint, the great tribulation kicks off. And then the day of the Lord is occupying the last half of the second half, possibly maybe only the last really full year of the last half, but this chart just shows it to you as half of the second half just for ease of viewing. We're not saying we pre-raptures don't really know exactly where the rapture happens. This is just for illustration purposes only. In other words, it's like those little stickers you see on your rear view mirror. Images are not to scale. Images may be closer than they really are, or something like that. In other words, don't take this exactly that I'm trying to say that the rapture happens exactly whatever time that you figure that out. But the main point is that pre-wrath rapture says that the rapture is sandwiched between the great tribulation and the day of the Lord, or God's wrath. Indeed, as we're going to find out tonight, the rapture, the pre-wrath rapture, actually initiates God's wrath. Indeed, the rapture and resurrection, which are the same event, but just two different aspects of the same event, the rapture and God's wrath are back-to-back events. They take place on the same day. Maybe one in the earlier part of the day and one in the latter half of the day. I'm not sure. Don't press me on that. I'm just saying that they take place on the same day. They could be hours apart from one another. I'm not getting that picky. The scriptures aren't that granular. They don't afford me that amount of detail. But they do tell me, and I think we're going to find this tonight, and we'll press this case, that they happen on the same day. And you have to remember also, in order for this to make sense, as you're looking at this chart, rapture and resurrection are events that are fairly quick. Paul tells us that the translation of our bodies from what we're in right now, as far as living people, and being changed into the type of body that Yeshua has, happens at the twinkling of an eye. So that sounds very fast, in an instant, almost like you blink and you miss it type of thing. Likewise, the resurrection, although it could be a little kind of a slower process where the bodies of those who are in Messiah that have already died have to be raised out of the ground and then meet their disembodied versions that come out of heaven, and then they meet up together, and then the body itself is either changed or it was changed when it came out of the earth or something like that. Either way, that event is probably not a twinkling of an eye. It's probably a little longer drawn out. Could be maybe a little bit of a process, but either way, the rapture and the resurrection are still, by comparison to the day of the Lord, very quick. I picture them taking place quickly, like within moments, right? Rapture and resurrection. By comparison, the day of the Lord is not 24 hours long, contrary to what the name sounds. However, there are passages in the Old Testament that use the phrase day of the Lord, right? Yom Adonai, where the word Adonai there is the tetragrammaton name for God. But day there is just the context-dependent word yom, which can mean 24 hours or it can mean not 24 hours. It could even be a full year. Isaiah seems to even hint at that the day of the Lord could perhaps be a full year, like a Sabbath year when put in contrast or comparison to the other 6 years that comprise the 70th week of Daniel, i.e. the full 7 years. If we say that the day of the Lord is that Sabbath year, then it's at least one full calendar year long. Of course, we're talking about a prophetic year, so 360 days, not a Gregorian calendar like 365. But they're not too much far different in terms of duration. But either way, the point I'm trying to make, and we're going to catch this tonight, is that day of the Lord is longer, but the rapture/resurrection initiates it, and the initiation is included as part of the day of the Lord. Right? The rapture and the resurrection are part of the day of the Lord. We could say they're the day of the day of Christ, or the day of Jesus, because the Bible does use those terms. And perhaps that lets us know that there's some positive aspect to the day of the Lord. It's not all doom and gloom and judgment. I mean, most of it is, don't get me wrong. That's the way the Old Testament describes it and the New Testament. It's a day of fire, and the themes of fire and burning and judgment and recompense and retribution and punishment against the wicked. That is the primary theme and purpose of the day of the Lord, but it is initiated by that positive aspect for us believers, which we read about in the Old Testament as well as in Luke chapter 21, when Jesus said that when you see these things, which I believe the immediate precedent is the sign of the sun, moon, and stars, and the sign of the really the great tribulation leading into the sun, moon, star sign, sixth seal, and then the supernatural brilliance of Jesus. When you see these things, because Jesus is approaching planet Earth at that point in time, look up, because your redemption is drawing near, or drawing nigh, as it says in the old KJV. So let's talk about that tonight. Let's look just real quick at some other slides before I move into this topic. Here are the same 4 rapture views, but one noticeable difference is that the post-trib view has the rapture happening after the wrath of God, whereas earlier, I go back to this one, the rapture happens after the wrath of God. I'm sorry, are those both the same? Give me a second, let me move forward. Okay, in this slide, they're both the same. It's just that the length of the wrath of God is different. In this version, which post-tribbers aren't agreed upon in their on all their details, like we pre-wrathers, there's less concise teaching out there. Really, the pre-tribbers have the biggest advantage because they've been around for the longest in terms of systematic theology that's been examined by the most amount of Christians, as well as cross-examined by those who go through seminaries. The pre-trib has the advantage here in this race. They've got more of their more consistency across most of their models. They're more consistent in most of their models, versus when you start moving down to the mid, the pre-wrath, and the post-trib, there's less consistency. There's a little more splintering going on, fracturing going on across different models. There's some differences. And so we're kind of seeing this in the post-trib version. The one I saw earlier, in fact, let me go like this and just show you the slides only version. If I go down to post-trib rapture here, you can see that the God's wrath / tribulation runs the entire 7 years, but in this version, it is the wrath of God / day of the Lord is only a mere 3.5 years long. So let's go back over to my slide here. So there's another slide we can look at here. This is similar to the one we just looked at. Notice in the post-trib version, wrath of God is just 3.5 years long, and then rapture is at the far end. So this is identical, basically, to this one. Just the 4 are in a different view, they're in a different spot. And also, this slide shows the 30 and the 45 days, versus this one didn't. But there's one more I want to show you. This version of the post-trib, the pre-trib, the mid-trib, and the pre-wrath are all the same. Just, well, not quite. The mid-trib is shorter. The mid-trib has, the day of the Lord is different. Sorry, let me go back to this one. When I go back up to, where was it? Mid-trib here. When I go to mid-trib here, you can see that the God's wrath is about 3.5 years long. But when I go over here, it also is 3.5 years long. But look what happens to the post-trib in the lower left corner. The day of the Lord suddenly switches places with the rapture. So this is where we have some sharp disagreement between some of the post-tribbers. In this view that you're looking at, this model, God's wrath is poured out first, and then the rapture comes second. Really, I think this name is misleading. I would not call this post-trib rapture. I would call this post-wrath. Because truly, the rapture in this view takes place after everything takes place. Tribulation, wrath, and then rapture. But when you look at this one in the lower left corner, rapture takes place, and then day of the Lord is 24 hours long. A lot shorter than it was in that previous slide. That means, according to this version of post-trib, whoever's holding to this particular version, they're still trying to say that, according to 1 Thessalonians 5:9, Christians are not subject to God's wrath, and therefore they have to have a rapture prior to wrath being poured out, versus in this model, they're comfortable with saying, we can go through wrath, but God's just going to have to shelter us in place, something to that effect. All right, so going back to this one. So there's one more view I want to show you, and then I'll jump into the study. A gentleman by the name of Joel Richardson, of whom I highly respect and have a lot of agreement with, and a lot of affinity with, especially his love for Israel and his embracing of a Torah-based lifestyle for Christians. He holds to a view that he likes to call hybrid, pre-wrath, post-trib. That's his wording. But I've heard this before by other teachers as well. Notice what he does is he takes the rapture and places it at the end of the 70th week, just like everyone else does, every other post-tribber does. But he has some of the trumpets being poured out before the rapture, and then some of the bowls being poured out after the rapture during the 30-day and 45-day time period. So he's trying to show that the rapture isn't until near the end of the week, but at the same time, Christians are immune to the full brunt wrath, i.e. the bowls. So in this way, he's trying to probably... It looks like he's trying to recreate this type of model where we have a rapture and then a day of the Lord, which is absurdly short, although he seems to be separating the trumpets part of the day of the Lord from the bowls part of the day of the Lord, if I'm understanding his model correctly. It's not very precise. Seems to be that's what's going on. But anyway, either way, we're looking at different rapture views that are, one of us is right and some of us are wrong. I mean, if you just look at the post-trib versus the pre-trib, they're diametrically opposed. I think that the pre-wrath model and the post-trib model have a lot in common. And as I've mentioned to my good friend and longtime study buddy in the chat room with me right now, in the Skype chat room, I wouldn't fall on my sword for the pre-wrath model, but I wouldn't fall on my sword for the post-trib either. None of the rapture models are worth dying for, in my opinion. I'm holding to a view that I think is simply makes the most sense of all the scriptures involved, harmonizes the most consistently across all the passages in question. But you know, if you held a sword to my throat and said, "Renounce pre-wrath, or we'll take your life," embrace post-trib, then I would say, "Okay, I'm a post-tribber. Sign me up." You know, big deal. Sign me up for pre-trib if for that same vein. I'm not going to die for the rapture position that I'm teaching, but I am strongly convinced that the pre-wrath model is the right one, but it's just not a conviction. So, you guys cool with that? All right, let's check the time real quick. We have got, 43 minutes left in the study. All right, let's jump into the study. Oh, I forgot. There's one more chart here that we'll eventually interact with because it deals with the seals, right? You like that rhyme? Deals with the seals. And any study on end times events, particularly the seventh week of Daniel, cannot properly be timed without dealing with the seals and then the trumpets and then the bowls. Meaning, part of the strength of the pre-wrath position is that we take a hermeneutic that looks at the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls as happening sequentially one after the other in consecutive fashion, and not happening all at the same time like some views take. There's the slightest bit of overlap in the book of Revelation between the end of one of those sets and the beginning of the other set that comes right after it. For instance, the seventh seal is as if it pours out the seven trumpets, and then the seventh trumpet is as if it initiates or pours out the seven bowls. But I don't believe that means that all of the seven trumpets happen consecutive with the timing of in other words, in totality of the seventh seal, and likewise, the totality of the seven bowls do not happen consecutively time-wise with the seventh trumpet. In other words, all three of those do not overlap in that fashion. Seventh seal, seventh bowl, seventh trumpet. There's not an overlap in that regard. But I know some who hold that position. I'm not here to argue with you if you hold that position. I'm just trying to say that I don't hold that position, and it's based on certain chronological markers in the book of Revelation.